an honor and a privilege to deliver the Aladi Memorial Lecture. Given that this is happening as in memory of and as a tribute to one of the greatest legal minds that India produced, let me begin by putting forward before you an argument of a legal philosophical nature. One which maybe he would have approved of, but I'd like to think, I did not know Sri Aladi personally, but I'd like to think he would have approved of the argument, or at least would have considered it worthy of debate. The argument is this, that India's economic policy, both in general direction and specifics, India's economic policies of the last 2 decades have been essentially violative of the Constitution of India. Essentially violative of the Constitution of India. Almost everything we've done. In what way are these policies and directions violative of the Indian Constitution? They are, if you see the directive principles of state policy as important, I do, deeply so. I see the directive principles of state policy as the soul of the Indian Constitution. The fundamental rights may be the heart, but the directive principles are the soul. The directive principles mark out the Indian Constitution from almost any other. Every constitution has its set of fundamental rights, and constitutions are about legal frameworks and the laws, what the do's and don'ts, primarily the don'ts, and the difference is that the directive principles of state policy are not about what can't be, what is. They're about what should be, what ought to be. They offer you a vision of a society. That, I think, makes both the directive principles and the Indian Constitution somewhat special. Look at the ones that are violated. How the directive principles begin by telling you, of course, this is the point at which some smart lawyer gets up and tells you they are not enforceable in a court of law. It usually means the person hasn't read the rest of the directive principles. Because the clause that says that they are not enforceable in a court of law says, I quote, "The principles herein laid down are nevertheless fundamental in the governance of the country, and it shall be the duty of the state to apply these principles in making laws." Fundamental to the governance of the country. The next line says, "The state shall strive to promote the welfare of the people by securing and protecting as effectively as possible a social order in which justice, social, political, and economic shall inform all the institutions of national life." Exactly the opposite has happened in the last 20 years, when inequality has grown faster than it ever has in our history as an independent nation, faster and is at worse levels than at any time since the British Raj. The directive principles also say, "The state shall in particular strive to minimize inequality." Shall in particular strive to minimize inequalities in status, facilities, and opportunities, that not only amongst individuals, but also amongst groups of people residing in different areas and engaged in different vocations. To my mind, Article 39 is more important than any of the fundamental rights. A, women and men equally have the right to adequate means of livelihood. B, and this is critical, B and C are critical to looking at the violations of the last 20 years. Article 39B says that the ownership and control of material resources of the community, the ownership and control of the material resources of the community are so distributed as best to subserve the common good. And you've had greater concentration of wealth and deeper levels of inequality than at any time in your independent history. A huge violation. But the next principle, I think, even more important, C, that the operation of the economic system does not result in the concentration of wealth and means of production to common detriment. The Constitution lays down that the operation of the economic system should not result in the concentration of wealth and the means of production to the common detriment. Day before yesterday, Forbes magazine declared that the 100 richest Indians were now all dollar billionaires. We are now the third ranking nation in the world in dollar billionaires. Maybe second after the United States. But I think Russia is slightly ahead. However, the cumulative wealth of our billionaires is far greater than those of the Russians. Meaning, forget the per capita income of the masses. The per capita wealth of our billionaires is far greater than those of Russia and China. Those guys are worth about $1 to $1.5 billion each. Ours are worth about $3.5 billion each. And of course, there's no comparison. The Chinese billionaires are all in the 1.2 billion. And where Russia is concerned, there is our obvious moral superiority. At the end of every 5 years, Russia sends all her billionaires to prison. We send ours to parliament. A mature democracy. The 2014 parliament, we elected in May. Let me congratulate all of you and myself. 83% of the MPs are now billionaires. 82% of all our MPs are now billionaires. That's a gigantic growth rate from 53%, which was the figure in 2009. In which sector do you see that kind of growth rate? Yeah. Now, 82% of the word, of course, is crorepati's, not millionaires, not crorepati's. 82% of them are crorepati's. And these guys are going to represent a nation with the hungriest population in the world, with the highest malnourishment in the world. Yeah. And the directive principle says that the operation of the economic system does not result in the concentration of wealth. It's resulted in millionaires taking over your parliament. That's what it's resulted in. It's resulted in 100 individuals in a population of 1.25 billion, 100 individuals accounting for 12 to 14% of your gross domestic product. That's what it's resulted in. If that is not a violation of the Constitution's directive principles, I don't know what is. That the health, principles go on to say that the health and strength of men and women and the tender age of children are not abused, and that citizens are not forced by economic necessity to enter avocations unsuited to their age and strength. Children and the conditions of freedom and their childhood and dignity and growth and youth are to be protected against exploitation and against moral and material abandonment. There are also, I won't go into all the details, the right to work, the right to education, of which we have made a very truncated piece of legislation, effectively killing the directive principle. You know, if one of my colleagues was in Gurgaon a few weeks ago, where all the schools are, of course, violating the right to education in various ways, she found a little landless laborer's daughter on the edge of Haryana. I mean, a laborer in the town, edge of town, his 8-year-old or 10-year-old daughter was going to a privileged school. So my colleague was quite impressed and asked the girl, so what is it like to interact with all these children from those elite backgrounds? She said, I don't know. I've never seen them. They hold a separate class for us in the evening. So there you are, the operation of the economic system. There is just and humane conditions of work that the directive principles talk about. Just and humane conditions of work at a time in the last 100 days when the first achievement of the Modi government has been tom-tommed and celebrated by the media, labor reforms. You see, the problem with this country is labor reforms. These workers don't work, right? They're disobedient. We should remove their rights. What are you talking about? You're talking about a country where 93% of the workforce is in the unorganized sector where they have zero rights. And learned professors from our mutual alma mater, JNU, Professor Dipankar Gupta goes on to say that the first thing that ought to be done is to sort out these labor reforms, which means essentially taking away what little rights the remaining 7% of the workforce has. The baseness of it, the cruelty of it, the inhumaneness of it is just mind-boggling. How far you have traveled from your directive principles of the Constitution. Here's one that guaranteed to make you laugh. If you look at what's happened in the last 20 years and the labor reforms, the Constitution holds that it is necessary and important to work towards participation of workers in the management of industries. Okay. Can you think of anything remotely resembling this happening in the last 20 years? And protection of the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other weaker sections from social injustice and all forms of exploitation. Also, material resources of the community. Reflect for a moment on the hundreds, thousands of resource conflicts as we try to grab the resources, the only resources that many poor people have, right here, Andhra, Telangana. I was a few weeks ago in Odisha, in those 11 submergence villages in Odisha, which are going to be sacrificed for Polavaram. It was interesting and funny. It was a sort of graveyard humor, what was going on. The government of Odisha had earlier assured the villages in the Malkangiri Poteru area that not a single person will be displaced, not a single village will be drowned, and they made even the current minister, Oram, had even made a promise to that effect by going there. And as proof of their commitment to the people, huge development projects have been undertaken there, and a 20-kilometer stretch took me 4 hours to cover because they were putting roads everywhere. They were building culverts, they were building bridges. So on one side, a government is building roads, bridges, and culverts for the first time. On the other side, a government is preparing to drown all those roads, bridges, and culverts. All of them are guaranteed to go in the submergence. Apart from Polavaram, there are thousands of others, none on that scale, but thousands and thousands of other displacements and resource conflicts. I would certainly urge you to read a new book on Polavaram by another Hyderabadi, Uma Maheshwari. I think it's a terrific book on what Polavaram and the Godavari River more largely are about. These principles also speak about the levels of nutrition standards of living and public health, about the need to raise the levels of nutrition. Really, what actually has happened on the levels of nutrition? The calorie intake of the poorest 25% is 30 to 50% lower than the calorie intake of the top 25% of the population. If we make that gap between 5% between the top 5% and the bottom 25%, the gap doubles. The calorie consumption of the bottom half of the population has been declining since 1987. Both calorie and protein consumption of the bottom 50% have continued to decline in the growth period since 1987. Well, so much for the directive principles, and let's go further. It's barely a couple of weeks ago since the media and the elite celebrated 100 days of the Modi government in power. I won't speak about the media because at this point, the media are an embarrassment not only to themselves, but to Mr. Modi's public relations officers who must be feeling insecure about their jobs. So since the media are doing so much better, the sycophantic projection, that PR firm which he had hired, I don't think they have much I don't think their contract need be renewed. The first 100 days, so we've had that tamasha over the first 100 days. I ask myself this question, whether it's Mr. Modi or whether it's Mr. Dr. Manmohan Singh or whoever, what happens in those 100 days typically in rural India? What are the typical 100 days? And it's regardless of which one of these different people have been there in the last 20 years. What happens in those 100 days typically in rural India? Well, this is what happens, and all the data is official. In 100 days, 4,600 farmers commit suicide in rural India. 46,000 to 69,000 attempt it. The police say the attempt ratios are 10 to 12 for one successful suicide. That's the police figure. NGOs like Sneha, which work with suicide victims, say that's nonsense. It's 15 times. The ratio is 15 to 1. 15 attempts to one successful suicide. So, 46,000, you choose the police. 69,000, you choose the independent assessments. So, in 100 days, 4,600 farmers will commit suicide. 46 to 69,000 will attempt it. 200,000 will cease to be farmers. The country is losing full status, full-time farmers at the rate of 2,000 a day for the last 20 years. By full-time farmer, I mean main worker cultivator as defined in the census of India, which is you ought to have done farming for 180 days in a year. Not less than that. Less than that, you're a marginal farmer. If you're working 6 months or more in a year on that thing, obviously your main income is from that occupation. I'm just saying this because I used to think that why did they have 180 days? Why did the Babus decide on this figure? And I've sort of concluded that it's because Babus work about 180 days in a year. So, but really the figure comes from 6 months shows that you are dependent, mainly dependent on this. So that person is called a main worker cultivator. The population of main worker cultivators has fallen and fallen dramatically. Till 91, it was rising. Till 1991, it was rising. Meaning people with land, it was rising. Between 91 census and 2001 census, the number of full-time farmers fell by 7.2 million. Between 2001 census and 2011 census, the number of farmers declined by 7.7 million. That's a total of 15 million decline in 20 years. You do the math. We're talking, in the last 10 years, we're talking about 2038 every day. Now, which section is rising? This is in a time of rapidly declining rural population growth rates. The fall in rural population's growth rate is much higher than the fall in the urban population's growth rate. Okay? Especially if you're comparing it to the age states. Though the family size is still much bigger. So, 4,600 suicides, 46,000 to 69,000 attempts, all in 100 days. 200,000 farmers will cease to be full-time farmers. Thousands will have left the countryside. Tens of thousands will have left the countryside in 100 days, headed for urban areas in search of jobs that are not there. In the capital city of Delhi alone, there are estimates of between 100,000 and 200,000, 1 lakh and 2 lakh adolescent girls from Jharkhand working as full-time maids, domestic maids on 24-hour call in the houses of the better off of Delhi. Jharkhand's a very small place. I mean, it's a small population. It does not have a big population. Okay? It took about 20 odd million out of Bihar. That's about all. Between 1 lakh and 2 lakh adolescent girls working. Yeah. Remember the principle that the tender age and youth of childhood will not be subjected to exploitation and abandonment. Did the Constitution's framers ever foresee how seriously those principles would be violated and despicably violated? In the 100 days, a few thousand children will die of malnourishment and hunger-related diseases in your country. In 100 days, thousands more children will enter grade 3 and grade 4 malnourishment, which are stages of malnourishment from which it's very hard to stage a comeback. From grade 4 malnourishment, there are no comebacks. You can live, but you'll be a vegetable. From grade 4 malnourishment, your cranial capacities, everything are severely damaged. All the data that I give you is official. One more piece of official. In the 100 days, and this is based on your latest budget, in the same 100 days, that all these astonishing things will happen in rural India, the government of India alone writes off in the budget 1,45,753 crores in concessions to the richest 1% or 2% of the country. You can all read these figures if you are interested, and I hope damn well that you'll be interested in the annexure to the budget called the Statement of Revenue Foregone. Last year's, the 2013 write-offs, under just 3 heads, excise duties, customs duties, and direct corporate income tax, amount to 5,32,000 crores. Every year for 6 years, the amount written off for the super rich in waivers has been close to or higher than the budget deficit. The single largest item in 2-3 years in the last 7 years, we have data only for 9 years. And do you know how much the concessions add up to? 36.5 trillion rupees. Trillion. Just try accommodating 12 zeros in your head. That is 36.5 lakh crores. Not 36.5 lakhs. 36.5 lakh crores is 36.5 trillion rupees. Do you know what you can do on 36.5 trillion rupees? You can run the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme for only 105 years at current levels of funding. Which means that every agricultural laborer living today can have 2 lifetimes on the NREGS. It actually works out. You can run the Food Security Act, another truncated, amputated, mutilated directive principle. You can run that for 31 years. Just on this year's budget, 5,32,000 crores, you can run the NREGS for, about 3 decades, and the Food Security Act for 5 years. For 4.5 years, if you want to be precise. So don't tell me there's no money. What you have is inequality. What you have is what the Constitution described as the operation of the economic system leading to a concentration of wealth and the means of production to the detriment of the common good. Okay? So you look at the kind of inequalities that have grown. By the way, what is rural? What is this rural India? In the census, incidentally, rural is anything that is not urban. Okay? Rural is anything that is not urban. I'm not joking. Well, in most parts of the world, that is more or less the principle. But the census, so then you have to know what is urban, which means a density of more than 400 per square kilometer. See, the statutory towns, there are 2 kinds of towns, statutory towns, census towns. Statutory towns are municipality, corporation, municipal boards, all the paraphernalia, your fire brigade, your police service, all this stuff. The rest, what is defined as urban, would have to have a population density of more than 400 per square kilometer, would require that 75% of the male workforce is in agriculture, is out of agriculture. In urban area, it would mean that 75% of the male workforce is not in agriculture, and a minimum population of 5,000. This is what is urban. The 3 principles going together make an area urban. Anything that doesn't fall into this, including outgrowth areas of a town which are called urban agglomerations, is rural. What does the census of 2011 show? By the way, that's the most extraordinary census in our history as an independent nation. It shows higher levels of migration than even at the time of the partition. Not even the 51 census shows you that. Not even the 61 census shows you what the census of 2011 show you. So you see, between 81 and 2001, statutory towns, properly evolved towns, the real thing, were growing. Census towns, which are arbitrary towns, little parts of villages have collapsed and become the urban periphery. Those were mercifully not growing. In the last 10 years, statutory towns have completely stagnated. Census towns have almost trebled. What does it tell you? 3,000 plus new census towns. What does it tell you? It tells you that agriculture has collapsed in those thousands of villages because less than 25% of the male workforce remains in agriculture. That's what it tells you. So when we talk about rural India and the predicament of the rural and the crisis of the rural India doesn't have a crisis. It has many crises in plural. It has a water crisis, a hunger crisis, an inequality crisis, a crisis of resources and conflict, a crisis of health, a crisis of food, a crisis of unemployment, a crisis of de-skilling, a crisis of gender, caste, and social justice that is sharpening. You name it, they've got it. But a crisis spelled CRISIS, we all of us have it. Not just rural India. Because we have to decide, we have to understand, can any society sustain these levels of inequality and injustice? And for how long can they sustain it? I think the answer is pretty clear, but one only looks at the answer if one faces or confronts the question. You cannot sustain it. It's not just a material crisis. And this is where all of us, the privileged, come in. It's not just a material crisis, but a moral one. Not just a social and economic one, it is a moral one. It's not just a crisis of the intellect, but of the soul. Okay? After more than 2 decades of what we are pleased to call the economic reforms, and 1 decade of 9% growth, 46%, 40 to 46%, depending on what measure you take, of Indian children below the age of 5 are malnourished. What did your 9% growth do to you? What did it do for them? Whose growth? Growth for whom? Growth for what purpose? Edward Abbey, the American ecologist, said, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. That grows 10%, 20%, and the faster it grows, the sooner you're dead. The nonsense, this insane obsession with a neoliberal understanding of growth leads you to some peculiar situations. Which was the fastest growing economy in the world in 2003? Afghanistan. Because the previous year it had been bombed into the Stone Age by the United States. If you built 2 bridges and 1 school, you had doubled the GDP of Afghanistan. And Afghanistan in 2003 recorded 21% growth. Okay? 60% of that growth came from the cultivation of opium. It's growth. We should be celebrating it. Right? It was David Attenborough, I think, who said, if you believe in infinite growth on a very finite planet, you are either insane or you're an economist. One in 3 of the world's malnourished children live in India. 31% of all stunted children live in India. And that figure has not materially changed after 9% growth for a decade, nor has it stopped you from slipping further and further and further down the rungs of the Human Development Index, a country that now ranks between 2 and 3, between the first 4 in dollar billionaires, ranks 135 in the UN Human Development Index. Just look at the colossal gap, the inequality gap. In the Global Hunger Index of the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, you rank, out of 81 hungriest nations in the world, you rank 63 or 65 now. Doing better than you, above you, is Rwanda, which had a genocide and a civil war. You'll be pleased to know that we've beaten the pants of Zimbabwe, though. We're ahead of them. And by the few decent programs we have, the midday meal, all are under assault. Corporations have tried to lobby with government and actually succeeded in Pune for a week to substitute midday meals with premix, Tetra packs which can just be heated in microwave. The children rejected it and there was near rioting and then it was withdrawn. But that's how it is. You're handing over the material resources of the community to the hands of a few, doing exactly what the Constitution begged you not to do and said you shall not do. Inequality renders the poor and the destitute that much more vulnerable to disasters, including those climate change may bring. It reduces the access of the poor to basic. But let me talk to you about this inequality for a second. Last year and this year, when roaming around the areas of Marathwada, didn't you all hear about it? Century's greatest drought, biggest drought, bigger than 1972. In India, to get covered by the media, you have to be biggest, fattest, shortest, tallest, something. And India will always figure in, when people tell me India is 5th in this production, or 4th in that, you're always going to be 3rd or 4th in everything. You're 1.25 billion people. You can't help being 3rd or 4th in most things. But you're 135th in human development. How did you manage that? How did you manage that? With 9% growth. Let me show you the kind of lifestyles. It's a planet I want to introduce you. There are parts of Hyderabad which are part of this planet. It's a sort of disembodied planet coming up in a few corners of different cities. While I was roaming around in Marathwada and Western Maharashtra in the drought areas, oh, by the way, the same areas which send the richest members of parliament to parliament, apart from Andhra Pradesh United. It's a sheer joy to read the election affidavits of MPs from Maharashtra. Mr. Praful Patel at one end, in 27 months as a minister, added 43 crores to his assets, which means that he was adding 5 lakhs a day to his assets as a minister. He was then in charge of Air India, whose employees had not been paid for 6 months. The grade 4 employee of Air India earns 2 to 3 lakhs in a year. He was earning 5 lakhs in a day and presiding over a ministry that had not paid its employees for 6 months. Anyway, at least he put down that figure. Mr. Sharad Pawar's affidavit, I remember the first one in 2004, I was stunned. It said his worth was 8 crores only. Now, well, Mr. Pawar is a busy man, and I sort of figured that while putting it down, he might have been confused whether the figure required was annual income or daily income. But yeah. So anyway, we'll leave it there. But Marathwada and Western Maharashtra were in the middle of drought. I found no drought. I found a gigantic water crisis, which will get worse even if you have a good monsoon because of the way we are using the water. We have, as I've said, an inequality crisis. You've had a resource conflict crisis. Look at your water crisis. You are 16% of the world's population with 4% of the world's water. Okay? And how are you using that water? We need to have this crisis. You need to have this crisis. Well, in the same areas where the drought was really acute, including Mumbai-Pune highway, I came across buildings, structures where you had multi-storied buildings with a swimming pool on every floor. Please. This is known as Aquaria Grande. It's set to come up in Goregaon in Mumbai. There are 37 floors in this building and there are 2 towers, so 74 swimming pools. Now, here's the interesting thing from my point of view. Can you show us the next one, please? That's how the artist's vision, my nightmare, the artist's vision of 74 swimming pools. Luckily, the thing is stopped because of the amount of noise, and at least it hasn't progressed for whatever reason. Can you move forward? 74 swimming pools in all their lit up glory at night. Go on. Here we have Chennai, far more refined culture, 1 every 4 floors. Then go on. This is my favorite ad. On the road from Mumbai to Pune, there are 23 villas that have each a swimming pool in one complex. Look at that. I love that slogan. Luxury homes with an attached forest reserve. In Maharashtra, even the damn tiger doesn't have an attached forest reserve. Can you go on? Now, this is the residence of one gentleman. Mr. Mukesh Ambani's, I don't know what you want to call it. I have no words, I'm speechless. It, I think, has 5 swimming pools. It has, so far, only 3 helipads. Yeah, so it's all in the blueprint. You can read up on it. And don't ask how much electricity it consumes. But it consumes so much, but he pays on time, you see. So the electricity department electricity board gave him a 10% discount for prompt payment. A few lakhs is the amount. Go on. That's it, closer. Go on. Now, not very far from that ad of the luxury villas are people who collect water in the traditional Indian method on these places. Bucket queues for hours and hours from 4 a.m. in the morning. Go on. Saying she has been to 6 different water points when I met her that day, and each time has to fill some buckets and walk back to her home. Go on. Go on. Now, here are people from Telangana, from Mehboob Nagar. This is another story of water. Here's the interesting thing. Now, if you're someone like me, perverse curiosity, when I see these buildings coming up, I go and ask the laborers. I interview the laborers, not the occupants. I ask them, who are you? Where did you come from? You're building these pools and swimming pools. Almost 100% of those people working on these super buildings are landless farmers and marginal farmers who have fled their villages as refugees of the drought. The water crisis in their villages drives them to Mumbai to build buildings with swimming pools on each floor. What thoughts would be in your head when you are putting in the 37th swimming pool and you have left your lands fallow to run dry, to produce nothing because there's no water? But there's water for the swimming pools. These people, they're very extraordinary. These are from your district of Mehboob Nagar. Professor Hargopal would know many of these people, perhaps, if he he would know that class of people very well. And with typical, where do they work and what construction work are they doing? They're working in the most sophisticated research facility, one of India's most sophisticated research facilities, the Baba Atomic Research Center, where they are doing construction labor. And they sleep outside the bark at night. This is monsoon, they are sleeping in the rain. And with typical Telugu humor, when I ask them about their water crisis, they say, now no crisis, we are sleeping in the rain. We are flooded. Every night we get water. Yeah, can you move? That's how well some of them managed to set up. This is all outside BARC, stone's throw from back. Go on. This was the lady who told me there's no crisis because now we're getting plenty of water. We're drowning in it. Go on. There you are. The swimming pools. These are not the swimming pool builders. These are Mehboob Nagar work. You have a crisis of, thank you. You have a crisis of migrations. And Telangana is one of the biggest sources of those crises of migrations. In 1993, I took a bus to Mumbai from Telangana, from Mehboob Nagar. You had to change 2 buses in order to reach Mumbai. It was called the bus to Mumbai, though people went to Kalyan, they went to Thane, they went to various other places. Generically, it was bus to Mumbai. There were 58 people in the bus, mainly some Lambada Adivasis, a couple of Mistris, and very poor people looking for work. 58 people in the bus. There was 1 bus service a week to Mumbai. It took 36 hours and you had to change buses twice. In 2003, I took the same bus. I boarded the same bus. In 2003, 10 years later, there were 42 services a week from that bus depot. I'm not counting the private ones because there are many fly-by-night operators which are illegal. But 42 buses were traveling on the route where 1 bus had traveled in a week. And these 42 buses, you didn't have to change. They were direct to Mumbai. Okay? So this is your crisis of migrations. Jharkhand girls, adolescents in Delhi. Telangana, the poor of Telangana in Mumbai. Whereas you can imagine they are given a very warm welcome by the Shiv Sena and the MNS and others. So you have this huge crisis of migrations. What does the census of India show you? It shows you the 2011 census, for the first time in your history, the addition to the rural population is lower than the addition to the urban population. For the first time in your history, Urban India has added more people than rural India. First time in your independent history. It happened once before in 1921. Do you know why? Because of the influenza epidemic that came back from France and killed anywhere between 11 and 16 million Indians. There was a net deficit, a net fall in the rural population. But we know that in the last 20 years, we haven't had any such epidemic that has mowed down millions, though we've had little things that make the upper middle classes terrified, and the newspapers behave as if tens of millions are dying, like the so-called plague in Surat, which killed 54 people, or SARS, which killed 3 people. And even that, those are disputed. Actually, 0 in India, the SARS syndrome. But these germs terrify us, the plague germs. You see, the trouble with plague germs is that they are notorious. See, we don't bother about tuberculosis and all the stuff that you leave to the poor. Plague germs are unacceptable. Plague germs are notorious for their non-observance of class distinctions. They board your aircraft and flight club class to New York. So there you have spraying on each flight now, right? At the end of each flight. So the census shows us that where in 2001, rural India added 113 million people, urban India added 68 million people, a gap of 45 million in favor of rural India. In 2011, rural India added 90 million people, urban India added 91 million people. That's a gigantic turnaround in 10 years. It cannot be accounted for by urbanization because it's the census towns that have grown, not the statutory towns. That is a form of urbanization, where villages have collapsed. It cannot be accounted for by population growth rates because the population growth rate in rural India fell more dramatically than in urban India. It's accounted for by migrations. Massive distress-driven migrations. That's what accounts for it. So you have an unbelievable situation where people are up and leaving in search of jobs that are not there. Your 9% growth did not create one new job for the people who mattered. You know, taking up, look, the devastated farmer of Mehboob Nagar isn't going to come to Hyderabad and join Infosys. Well, he can. Actually, he did. The Mandya farmers have joined. I've seen them in Infosys. They serve chai in the canteen. Yeah, they do. So yes, but that's a limited number of chai dealers that you can accommodate. What about the others? The Planning Commission's own report from its division called the Institute of Advanced Manpower Research tells you in India we have deviated from the ideal of decent work and employment for all. It says so in 2012 December, it says so categorically. Okay? So you have a crisis of what drives these crises? We have looked at the directive principles, let me look at the counter principles. What has driven it? This has happened not just in India, it's happened in most parts of the world. Inequalities have grown in every country in the world almost. Some exceptions somewhere that I'm not aware of, but yeah, forgive me, but I think one can say it. It's what I call, you see, the same package of economic principles, you can call it neoliberalism or you can call it globalization. I find capitalism is good enough to describe it. But it is in a different phase and it has unfolded with 8 or 9 packages worldwide. 1, the withdrawal of the state from sectors that matter to poor people. The state has not withered away as in the Marxist dream. That has not happened. The state is in fact more interventionist than it has ever been, and nakedly so in the interest of the super rich and the corporate world. That's the first. The withdrawal of this has come from sectors that matter to poor people. 2, huge expenditure cuts, the slashing of subsidies or life supports to ordinary people. Example, BPL and APL and targeting and everything else that took place. See, all this happened again under the great Maratha farm leader for 8 years. You see, for Mr. Pawar, he's a very secular person. There's no difference between BPL, APL, IPL. It's all the same. They're all revenue yielding instruments. Principle 3 across the world. Rapid transfers of resources and wealth from the poor to the rich. Resources in terms of the land you've grabbed from over 300 villages for Polavaram. Resources in terms of the land you're grabbing from those in Jagat Singhpur fighting POSCO, those you've tried to grab from in Kalahandi, those fighting Vedanta. Right? And so you all just look at your budget for the rapid transfer of wealth. Just look at the statement of revenue foregone, 5,32,000 crores written off. Do you know which was the biggest single customs item written off, apart from petroleum, of course, which affects everybody? The single biggest item written off in customs duties for 2-3 years in a row, not this year, but for 2-3. Gold, diamonds and jewelry, all Aam Aadmi items. 48,000 crores worth of customs duties written off in budget 2014-15. Look at the annexure, statement of revenue foregone. In 36 months, we have written off 1,67,000 crores worth of customs duties on gold, diamonds and jewelry. The unbridled rise of corporate power, and this is central to our time. The unbridled rise of corporate power, look at the fact, look at all over the world. In the year that Wall Street collapsed, the year 2008, American CEOs took home $18 billion in bonuses in a year where the USA lost 3.65 million jobs. It never affects them. It never affects them. No matter what. You see, as one of the more sane people in the economics profession wrote, that what is the difference between an economist and a dishwasher or a bus driver? The difference is that the bus driver and the dishwasher are punished for poor performance. The economist can bring down the world economy, but nothing's going to happen to him. Yeah? He'll be then called onto every TV channel to explain what went wrong. The guy who didn't have a clue that it was going wrong and was telling you that things have never been better. Anyway, the imposition of user fees and costs on those who can least afford it, and the privatization of just about everything, including intellect and soul. I used to wonder 10-15 years ago when I used to be introduced in various colleges, they would say, Mr. Sainath is a public intellectual. I used to wonder what that is. Then I figured out that most of the others have been privatized. So, they're all in think tanks and corporate planning cells. And so those of us who haven't sold out or who haven't found the right price yet, we are the public intellectuals. The growth of inequality is another part of this package. What is the difference? India always had inequality, for a few hundred years, yes. So what's different about inequality in the last 20 years? It's very different. Actually, inequality fell between 1947 and 1987. Inequality declined in terms of certain parameters. What is different about the inequality of the past 20 years? Never in India's history, after the colonial period, has inequality been so ruthlessly engineered, so consciously constructed, so explicitly embedded in your economic policy. Completely shameless. No apologies. And what I call the rise from 91, I've been using this word, the ideology of market fundamentalism, which is as religious a fundamentalism as any other, in fact greater because it recruits to all the other fundamentalisms by destroying the livelihoods of hundreds of millions. So then the undermining of local governance, the setting up, while Bangalore had a 5-man czar, led by Mr. Narayan Murthy, to plan the city, it couldn't put up the airport in time and resigned, and Bangalore's traffic is a delight, of course. So you have, you're looking at the migrations that have hurt. Telangana is one example. Wayanad is another. Kalahandi is another. In Wayanad, it's the one district of Kerala where there was no out migration. There was in migration in a tribal area, completely tribal area. There were in migrations first by Kannada Jains from Karnataka in the earlier centuries, and then by Christian settlers from Travancore and central Kerala, with the result that the church now owns large swathes of land, tribal land in Wayanad. And you never had out migration. When the agrarian crisis struck, you had out migration. In 97, Wayanad did not have Wayanad did not have a single bus, Kerala state transport bus, crossing the border into Karnataka, not one bus. In 97, it had 2 buses a day. In 2005, when I traveled that route 8 times, it had 24 bus services a day. People leaving, Kerala's wages are much higher than those of Karnataka, double. And people were crossing the border to work in Karnataka. Just think, what happened? What happened was the agrarian crisis. To this moment, to this day, the latest figure, and please understand, farm suicides are not the agrarian crisis. Farm suicides are an outcome of the crisis, not its origin. They are a manifestation of the crisis, not its material. They are a consequence of the crisis, not its cause. That said, close to 300,000, 3 lakh farmers have committed suicide in the last 19 years for which data are available. That means one farmer, in the last 10 years, one farmer every 32 minutes. You know how many of those are Andhra and Telangana farmers? And I was telling you about the change in population and the decline of farmers. The 2011 census shows us that the United State of Andhra and Telangana, the composite state, saw a decline in the last 10 years of 1.3 million farmers. Where did they go? You look at the next column, you'll know. The same composite Andhra state, including Telangana, which saw a decline of 1.3 million full-time farmers, in the next column you see a rise of 3.4 million agricultural laborers. Which means, across the country, millions of farmers are falling into the ranks of the agrarian underclass. That is what is happening. Many of them are leaving looking for jobs. That is not happening. They are not absorbed. So you have today in Andhra Pradesh this peculiar situation where you have 1.3 million farmers less and 3.5 million agricultural laborers more. Incidentally, one of the least looked at aspects of the crisis is what has happened to women in agriculture. Their burden, always they did the maximum amount of work on the farm, but women's work, as you know, is never recognized as work. Work is what men do. Right? The work of the woman was always the greatest share of work in agriculture. It has now doubled as so many men have migrated. More and more women are having to take up work in crop agriculture in addition to poultry, livestock, dairy, which was a large preserve of women in the countryside. In one, estimates of women and dairying range between 69 and 93%. Well, in everything they have, seeding is 72%, and preparing the land is 32%. But now it's doubled because and by the way, the pressure on women farmers, the pressure on women in the countryside to do additional work in agriculture is so great. I don't think it's an accident that the all India livestock population shows a decline. People are not able to cope with it because people have sold off cattle in distress to the abattoirs, but also no one is doing that kind of careful cattle breeding. And we have nothing but contempt for local and indigenous breeds. So those are falling even more sharply, but the entire cattle livestock population of this country has declined as the latest livestock census, for which I think the figures were out in May. They show a clear. So your crisis is multifold, it's across, but believe me, women are having it worst. Women in the countryside, and as the water scarcity grows, the distances you walk for water, the distances they walk for fodder, it's so simple and obvious. It looks very simple. It isn't. Like, for instance, two women I walked with in Amravati in Vidarbha. Their husband committed suicide. They owned a patch of father and husband, so of woman and daughter. They committed suicide. They owned a patch of lemon trees. Each tree needs 1 bucket of water in the day. It's not very far off. Okay, 200 meters, etc., 300. Then I calculated that the number of times they did that trip in a day meant that they were walking between 24 and 26 kilometers a day. And half that distance they were carrying filled buckets. Imagine. Then they come home, then they look after the kids, then they do the cooking, then they fetch the firewood. Yeah. What sort of labor, what sort of drudgery have we imposed on the woman laborer and the women farmer? Now, of course, there are those who argue that farm suicides are not important and migrations are a good thing. That's how Europe came up. That's how USA came up. Amongst those who have argued, great dons, academic dons of Columbia, have argued that farm suicides don't matter because there are so many farmers in India. Please read. Dr. Bhagwati and Dr. Panagaria have written that 53% of India's population is farmer. So actually the suicide rates are so low. I'm not joking, I'm telling you verbatim what they say. Against a base of 53% of the population, suicide rates are so low, we should strive to bring the suicide rates of other sections of society to these rates. Okay. Here are two clowns who don't know what a farmer is in the Indian. They don't know the definition of a farmer. They think that 53% of the population being engaged in farming means that 53% of the population are farmers. My dears, everybody in Bollywood is not an actor. Okay, actors are the smallest percentage of Bollywood. Okay, from the light boys to the dustman to the cleaner to the screener to the paint to the makeup people, for every actor there are thousands of people in Bollywood. Everybody in the education sector is not a student or an academic. There are far more millions of people in the education sector who are neither teachers nor students. Everybody in agriculture is not a farmer. Farmers constitute less than 8% of your population, full-time farmers. If you include marginal farmers, it comes to 9.9%. You include every agricultural laborer, it comes to 22%. But not to Don Bhagwati and Sancho Panagaria, who think that 53% of population are farmers. I mean, it shows you how much interest there is to know what's happening in the countryside, in the creme de la creme of Indian academia. Of course, it's not only the farmers who have a tragedy. I noticed that both dons are also sharing a tragedy. Despite their very public applications for posts in government, their prayers have not been answered. Not yet. And of migrations, England became prosperous, became a big empire. You see, migrations are a good thing. Why? Because feudalism broke down, the countryside broke down, privatization of the commons took place, enclosures of the land took place, and all the workers, all the farmers went off to the city, became the industrial proletariat, created the industrial revolution, became the best paid workers. Now, I think the most beautiful demolition of this came from my friend and inspiring economist, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, who pointed out how stupid and distorted this history is. All those people destroyed in the countryside of England and in Europe did not go to the cities of their countries to become industrial workers. The industrial workers of England and Europe were the highest paid in the world because they had the option of mass migrations to United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. There was a decade-long, several decades-long period in which Britain's migrations out of UK, United Kingdom, amounted to about half the annual growth of Britain's population. So where are our colonies? Where are we going to? Yeah, New Jersey has become a Gujarati colony, perhaps. I heard another name for it is New Gujarsey, because it's good. Yeah, but outside of that, we don't have options. What do? Conquer Bangladesh? Man, they've got a density problem, which forget about it. Do we settle people, or maybe we just go to war with China and settle all of them in Tibet, or all these? It didn't happen that way. The wages were high in England because the workers would migrate if they didn't get that wage. They would go off to the New World, as they called it. It was a very old world for people called natives of America, who suffered a genocide greater than that of the Jews of Auschwitz. In terms of percentage of the population, 98% of them were wiped out. Can you do that? Well, I know that there are people in India who think that that's not a bad idea because it's poor breed like flies, Just kill all of them and you'll be good. So, to pull it together and wind it up, new classes of people are emerging in this countryside. The predicament of the rural. I've been tracking a few people in Amravati around the bus stand. There are 2 Dalits who come every day into the city. Their village is on the edge of the town and the villages have collapsed into the. They come walking 5-6 kilometers into the town. Now, where do they work? They are cotton farmers. They do some amount of farming, and if you ask them their identity, they say farmer. They say farmer. Shetkari. That's what they say. But the number of days they're in farming is nothing really. It's at particular periods of time, and the number of days are falling. What do they do in Amravati bus stand? One of them works in a dhaba. He has 2 periods. The dhaba owner will not give him full-time employment. It's according to the traffic of the bus. So between 6 and 10 in the morning and 7 and 11 in the night, he'll have work. There will only be 2-3 permanent employees. It's a very big dhaba. And the rest are people like whom who will work so many hours in the morning, so many hours in the night. Then he goes and does construction labor. In fact, in my assessment, that's where he got the maximum payment on it, if you take per day. Highest payment came out of construction. He does head load porter at the bus in the hours between the dhaba hours. Who is this person? What is he? Is he a laborer? Is he a farmer? Is he a landless worker? Is he a construction laborer? I'm saying a kind of identity is developing on these urban peripheries, which is very difficult, at least for me, to categorize. Who is this man? What is he? His identity is farmer, Shetkari. He will tell you that. You can ask him 10 times, he will tell you 10 times, Shetkari. There are urban women in Gondia district, Mr. Praful Patel's Ilaka, who travel every day into rural Vidarbha to work as agricultural laborers and go back at night. They spend 20 hours a day. Why are they traveling into rural Vidarbha? Because Mr. Praful Patel's family shifted their BD business out of Vidarbha to go to Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand because you can save 5 rupees per ton. Or kilo, 5 rupees per quintal. Okay, you save on wages. So they shift out. So all those women who were rolling BDs at home, They're destroyed. So they catch a train. I have traveled with them. They leave their homes at 4 a.m. They return home after 11 p.m. How do we describe? They're urban. They're living in the Tehsil headquarters of Tiroda. How do you describe? The youngest women tell me that their youngest babies have forgotten the mother. They've never been awake when the mother is around. Okay? This is the predicament of the rule. When we talk of agriculture and we hear of productivity and wheat and rice, actually the per capita availability of food grain in this country has declined on every 5-year average since 1992, which is the first reform year for agriculture. Not 1991, because the agricultural calendar is June-July. Okay? So first reform year in agriculture is 1992. In the 20 years before the reform period, every 5-year average recorded an increase in food grain available per capita. In 1991, food grain available per capita in this country was 510 grams, the highest ever achieved. By 2011, I don't go on the years on which there are provisional figures. You know why. The final figures for 2011 were something like 432 or 436 grams. That's not a fall of 70 grams per Indian. It's a fall of 78 grams into 365 days into 1.25 billion Indians. You work out how many million tons it is. Yet, at one end of the spectrum, there are metros and towns where a new restaurant opens every day. Your issue, the predicament of the rural, is the unparalleled rise of inequality all across this country. That is the predicament of the rural. The last thing that I want to tell you about is to go back to the beginning. Can you do something about this? Of course you can. And I would say, what better place to start than the directive principles of state policy, where regime after regime is guilty of having violated and torn the guts and soul out of the Indian Constitution. You can unite more people on that basis. Defend your Constitution. Defend the directive. I will also say that instead of allowing governments like the UPA did, turning a directive principle into a truncated piece of legislation like the RTE or the Right to Food Security Act, which deprives that food security to tens of millions who had it before the act. In Maharashtra, the number of people no longer entitled to be covered is 1 crore, sir. Yeah? Because you decided on an arbitrary figure, 67%. Poverty figures in India are a delight. You see, in 4 years, the government of India had 3 commissions of poverty. For my sins, I served on one of them. First, there was the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector, which I think was a fantastic report that they produced, including our own YB Yugandhar, who was part of that commission, Kannan, Professor Arjun Sen Gupta, I want you to know one thing very important. The NCUS not only produced that famous report, they produced 10, 12 other reports. Government of India has dismantled the website, saying the commission is no longer in existence. So they've removed the website because they don't want you to read. That first report said on the first page, 836 million Indians live on an expenditure, not consumer expenditure, not income, of 20 rupees a day or less. 88% of those people, 88% of all Adivasis, 88% of all Dalits, and 85% of all Muslims are in that 836 million, apart from millions of poor OBCs, etc. This was not acceptable to Dr. Manmohan Singh, who reluctantly accepted the report and signed it. Immediately, they set up a second committee. Within a week, the Saxena committee, on which I was there, And we had some scintillating moments in the Saxena committee. I was not present on most occasions because I was teaching abroad that year. But when I went there, we had one debate on, are women really poorer than us? Now, the discussion on women's poverty was debated fiercely by 17 people sitting around the table, every one of them a male. There wasn't a woman within a mile's striking distance. And the thing was, one of those guys who is working with the NSS, yes, he is with the NSSO, he said, ऐसा कैसा हो सकता है automatic देना उसको women, the point was, women-headed households in rural areas must be automatically marked as BPL. ऐसा कैसा, कल मैं भी ये कर सकता हूँ. I can also declare my home a women-headed household. I told him, I think in your case it would be a singularly good idea. So finally, we grudgingly came to the consensus that women are not doing quite as well as we are. Not that they're poor. So then the automatic marking thing was given. Then they didn't like our committee report. We brought down poverty from 77% to 50%. That was not satisfactory. So they sent in a summons for Professor Suresh Tendulkar, third committee. Professor Suresh Tendulkar came in. You see, one Tendulkar raises the averages, the other Tendulkar depresses them. So, but unfortunately, the selectors preferred Suresh over Sachin. So, Dr. Suresh came in and brought it down from 50% to 42%. But here's the nub. All three committee report figures are still higher than the Government of India's official figure. Then elections took place, all sorts of things. Then somewhere someone in government thought, let's have one more committee. One man, so they brought in Dr. Rangarajan, who at the stroke of a pen brought poverty from 270 million to 360 million. So you see how meaningless it is. Dr. Madhu Dandavate once told me, I had gone to meet him to ask him to launch my book, which he agreed to do, and he did. But he was in a hurry. During the Narasimha Rao regime, please let me not start on Narasimha Rao. But during his regime, poverty fell to a record level of 19%. 19% by doing all sorts of stupid things. So then Madhu Dandavate, man of integrity and honesty, took over as deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, told them, remove all those nonsensical add-ons that you did. Poverty shot up to 39%. I was going up the stairs to meet him. He was coming down the stairs. He said, I can't talk to you now. Then he stopped, patted me on the shoulder and said, kill me, I say. I doubled poverty in your country today. Because it went back from 19 to 39%. This is the meaninglessness of the game. You have a moral crisis in addition to the economic, social, and political one. Let's go back to those directive principles. What happens if we take a clutch of the directive principles and convert them into a Bill of Rights? Enforceable Bill of Rights. You are then looking at a revolution of a very different kind. You're looking at a radical transformation if every Indian has the right to work and has the right to act against the state if that right is not enforced. You're looking at a very different world if you can create that. So let's go back to the constitution makers and the drafters and see what that incredible man Ambedkar said when he made what I consider to be perhaps the greatest speech on inequality in independent India, where he said, when the drafters, all these drafters, all the great names associated with it, when they handed over the draft constitution to the Constituent Assembly, Ambedkar said, I do this with a great sense of trepidation. Today, we have created a fine political democracy. Today, there is democracy in politics, but there is no democracy at all in society and economy. and the tension between the democracy in politics, in electoral politics, and the lack of absence, total absence of democracy in economy and society will implode our fine democracy. A truer word was never spoken. 65 years later, we are looking at staring that reality in the face. Yeah? And he goes on and even talks in another place of the betrayal of the French Revolution, where he says, in the West, out of liberty, equality, and fraternity, they took liberty and excluded the other two. They did not want to speak about equality. We should speak about equality. We need equality in society and democracy, said Baba Sahib Ambedkar. There's a beautiful passage in which he says, equality is another name for democracy. Much before Ambedkar, the leading American judge, in fact, Justice Louis Brandeis, after whom the Brandeis University is named, he squashed a petition by the American super rich. They were arguing for abolition of income tax as unconstitutional. It was a serious battle. In throwing out their petition after many hearings, he made a remark in his closing remarks. Brandeis said, "Gentlemen," for they were all men, "gentlemen, you can have great concentration of wealth, or you can have democracy, but you cannot have both. You cannot have both." You know, go back a little further. I think wherever I'm going, and I was recently back in Odisha, where the villagers of POSCO are still holding out, giving an example to every one of us of the reality that your rights, constitutional or otherwise, are only as secure as the process by which you defend them. They are only as secure as the process by which you defend them. And the villagers of Gobindpur and Dinkia have stood there and fought Central Reserve Police, State Police, mafia gangsters of the miners of POSCO, of everything. Something tells me that let's go back from Ambedkar and Brandeis to Victor Hugo, who said, "There is no force on earth mightier than an idea whose time has come." I think in India, that time has come, and the idea is social, political, cultural, economic, and gender justice. Thank you.